Who are these people?
Stella, she got stood up. Um, so Australian Prime Minister Albanese refuses to meet with Assange's wife. So this is from WSWS. Oscar Greenfeld over there. Um, in a gratuitous display of contempt, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese yesterday refused to, which would be a couple of days ago now, refused to meet with Stella Assange, the wife of Julian Assange, Australia's most prominent political prisoner. The snub came even as Stella was inside the federal parliament, having traveled to the country to campaign for her husband's freedom. Asked by independent MP Andrew Wilkie why he would not meet with Mrs. Assange, Albanese brushed aside the question, declaring, "Who I meet with is determined by the priorities that my office has." Which means
Okay.
what again? Like, I'm gonna do what I want. That's what that sounds like.
Press freedom, not an issue for you, like, because
Yes.
you don't, not an issue because you don't want people like exposing your shit. So
Mm-hmm.
if there is any.
So over the past month, Albanese has met with a multitude of business tycoons. He attended the wedding of right-wing radio shock jock Kyle Sandilands alongside a convicted drug dealer and reputed crime boss. So that's who his priorities his office has. Most recently, Albanese fawned over U.S. President Joe Biden in Tokyo. On the weekend, Biden is overseeing the attempt to extradite Assange from Britain and imprison him for 175 years for exposing American war crimes. Albanese proclaimed in Parliament he was not interested in meeting Assange's wife, which he said would be akin to a, quote, demonstration and, quote, grandstanding. Albanese sought to...
in the best possible way.
Yes. Like actually standing for some morals. Albanese sought to dress up the refusal by reiterating vague comments that, quote, enough is enough in relation to the Assange case. It's not like he's out, so apparently, and he cannot see that anything is served by the WikiLeaks founders' continued incarceration. So, I don't know, maybe talk to the lady's wife? While Albanese claims he has made this position clear to the U.S. administration, there is no evidence of that, including an extensive correspondence obtained under Freedom of Information requests between various American and Australian government bodies. Labor continues to give carte blanche to the very administration seeking Assange's destruction. So, private versus public policies here. The obvious question is, if Albanese won't meet with Assange's wife, a basic act of respect and courtesy that he has extended to thousands of others over the course of this year in office, why would anyone think the Prime Minister is waging a fight for the imprisoned Australian journalist's freedom behind closed doors? As part of her visits to Australia, Stella Assange yesterday addressed the National Press Club in Canberra. The speech was a powerful plea for Assange's freedom and exposure of the draconian conditions under which he is detained in Britain's maximum security Belmarsh prison, and a clear outline of the fundamental issues of democratic rights at stake in the attempted prosecution of her husband. Stella noted a groundswell of support for Assange. She stated, "I would like to thank the overwhelming dedication of the Australian people who have brought about a sea change in awareness and solidarity for Julian's plight. The unity and support for my husband is a source of enormous encouragement for our family. It nurtures Julian's ability to continue on." She added, "The reality is that to regain his freedom, Julian needs the support of his home country. This is a political case, and it needs a political solution." In discussing her presence in Australia, and also what she speaks about with her husband, Stella stressed Assange's connection to Australia. He had been raised in the country and had shared his extensive memories, from surfing in Byron Bay to beekeeping in Melbourne's Dadong Ranges and riding in a horse of New South Wales northern rivers. "That's how I imagine Julian when he is free," she said today. "Julian's feet only ever feel the hard, dull, even cement on the prison floor. When he goes to the yard for exercise, there is no grass, no sand, just the bitumen pavement surrounded by cameras and layers of razor wire overhead. I can tell you exactly what Julian is doing right now. It is 3 a.m. in London. Julian is lying in his cell, probably awake and struggling to fall asleep. It's where he spends 22 hours a day, every day. Julian's cell is about 3 by 2 meters. He uses some of the books to block out the unpleasant draft coming from the window in the cold winter nights. Stella outlined the draconian security procedures required for her and her 2 children to visit their father. They had to pass innumerable checkpoints, searches, and scans for their visit. The children had only ever seen their father in the inhospitable prison visiting room. For the elder of the 2, now 6 years old, prisons feature in his dreams and his nightmares. Turning to the case, Stella stated, a 175-year sentence is a living death sentence, a prospect so desperate that the English court found that it would drive him to take his own life. Rather than live forever in hell, we must do everything we can to ensure that Julian never, ever sets foot in a U.S. prison. Extradition in this case is a matter of life and death. She explained, for most people, Julian is a symbol of staggering injustice because he is in a prison on trumped-up charges for exposing the crimes of others, a symbol because he faces a bewildering 175-year sentence for publishing the truth, a symbol of a sophisticated form of state violence dressed up in complexity and indirection that not even Franz Kafka could have imagined. For the press and the public, Julian's case is the most brutal attack on press freedom that the Western world has ever seen. In the last 70 years, a foreign government is using the political offenses in its statute books to indict a foreign national abroad because of what he or she published in a different country. Accurate, damning publications exposing their war crimes. If sovereignty is to mean anything, if jurisdiction is a proper legal and political reality, the case against Julian cannot be understood as anything other than absurdity. Despite the dire threat to press freedom, the address was largely subjected to a media boycott. Only a handful of nationally recognized journalists attended. Several prominent publications sent junior staff, fresh out of university, armed only with arrogance and obnoxious questions based on the slanders that have been used to attack Assange. The shameful display underscored the fact that broad sections of the official media function as nothing more than state propagandists while they are cheering on each new step in Australia's integration with the U.S. preparations for war with China. This corrupted layer is hostile to a genuine journalist who exposed war crimes. In the Q&A, Stella, together with Jennifer Robinson, one of Assange's lawyers, elaborated on the issues in the case. 2 questions repeated the fraud that WikiLeaks had in 2016 received material from the Democratic National Committee via Russia. The questioners, despite refusing to be journalists, were hostile to the 2016 publications, even though they continued true and newsworthy information. In response, Stella emphasized what had been revealed. The 2016 publications shown that the campaign of Hillary Clinton had subverted the DNC primaries to scuttle the candidacy of Bernie Sanders. This was carried out even through internal DNC polling, showed Sanders would defeat Donald Trump, whereas Clinton would not. More broadly, Stella emphasized the core precept that journalists have a responsibility to publish information that is in the public interest. To suppress such information would be a violation of journalistic ethics. In reply to another question, Robinson noted the historic significance of the 2010 publications for which Assange faces prosecution. They'd exposed massive war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, including thousands of civilian deaths that have been covered up by the U.S. military. For those very same releases for which he now faces 175 years imprisonment, Assange and WikiLeaks in 2011 received a Gold Walkie Award, the highest honor in Australian journalism. Both Stella and Robinson thanked Albanese and the Labour government for their statements and noted that this marked a shift from previous administrations. There is no question that the tepid statements of the Labour officials reflect, in extremely limited and distorted form, the vast popular support for the WikiLeaks publisher. However, all experience has shown that no confidence can be placed in the capitalist governments to extend a benevolent hand and free Assange. Albanese was a senior member of the Gillard Labour government, which in 2010 and 2011 actively participated in the persecution of Assange. The current Labour government, moreover, is dramatically escalating Australia's front line in the U.S. preparations for war against China. This policy is incompatible with democratic rights and is being accompanied by a slew of reactionary national security prosecutions within Australia directly overseen by Labour. As the Socialist Equality Party has stressed, an Australian government will only fulfill its obligations to free Assange if it is compelled to do so by massed opposition from below. That means the development of a movement of the working class against the Labour government and its program of war, austerity, and authoritarianism. Thoughts, Care Bear?
It's this reminded me of, people hating Assange who love Bernie.
Yeah.
So, like, really anybody who supports Bernie even now, but especially back in 2016, 2020, knowing about Assange should be more applicable to you because, as Stella basically reported, like there's proof that the DNC basically cheated Bernie out of winning.
Yep.
And if he were to go against Trump, he would have won. So the idea that people are not necessarily aware of that, but then I know some people who are basically like fuck Assange who are like Bernie stands. It's just kind of like, a huge disconnect there. But then again, it makes sense because anything regarding Assange it's been severely suppressed, even for us. Like, I'm sure, like, when we cut out this segment, this is going to be heavily suppressed and
Yep.
at best demonetized. But, it's the idea of having that relate to having a president or the potential of a president who is really centrist in scope relative to like the rest of the world, but you can make the argument that he would have done more in certain ways to push the narrative towards more progressive policies within the limitations that we have in terms of our capitalist government over what we have currently.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that Assange exposed that, as well as the forever wars that we had in Iraq and Afghanistan, really should be talked about more.
Well, I also think the fact that they're all talking about, well, it's got to be a groundswell of support from below, and it's like, what, that exists. It's been here. It's been here for like a decade now, and then some. So like,
and then like people like shout out to Misty, who has been, people might just argue that she's like a one issue person in terms of like all she talks about is Assange, but
Assange
honestly,
encompasses so much. I mean, that's the problem.
And I would rather have someone who is fully invested in an issue and knows like I don't know as much about, and I admit I don't know as much about Assange other than like whatever you pull or whatever I pull to present to our family here, or whatever Misty tells us, or anything that I remember from Richie Medhurst, what he explained about Assange. Actually, really, he was the first one who even, mentioned the idea of Assange to me back in 2020. He was the first, and then, obviously Misty has carried the torch for me in terms of, and having interaction with her and going to protests, for in recognition of him. Since, it's a big deal, but people don't necessarily connect, as you said, that how much is tied to a very livelihood in this country, because there would be a lot of corruption otherwise that would not be talked about or even known about if it wasn't for a journalist like Assange. But he represents what true journalism is, which is not what it should be anymore. It's more or less propaganda. Going back to the tweet that I pulled in regards to, I forgot their names now, but the TikTok boys. If that's what I'm going to call them now, the TikTok boys.
Yeah.
Like, they mentioned like, oh, white supremacy is like the thing that's killing this country. No, it's the propaganda that you guys are spilling
Right.
that is making people dumb and making people like assume that what you're saying is truth when it's not. And having people just kind of living out a lie or not revealing the full truth of what is really happening.
Mm.
So the idea of people being fully aware, you can't have that, because then people will actually make moves in order to try and have a better life for themselves and their communities, which again, our government can't have that. Any capitalist government can have like an uprising of the proletariat.
Yeah.
But
Speaking of proletariats,